positive demand shock. I'm just giving the quick version here. Um, Same idea. So we're here in long run equilibrium at A, and aggregate demand increases, sticky wages, so that's why we're willing to produce more output in the short run. And so now we have this trade-off going on here in the short run. So you can get that lower unemployment, but we know it's not going to be sustainable, because we know if we wait for that adjustment to happen, wages are going to adjust. It's going to move us back here to point C, and so here we can stay here in the short term. But when inflation expectations adjust to the new higher inflation, then it's going to move us onto a new Phillips curve. And now we're on a worse trade-off between inflation and unemployment. We're here at point C, but now we have this particular trade-off until things change. And so just like over here, we're at this higher price level. Here we're thinking of it as a higher inflation rate. And so we don't want to just keep repeating that and just raising the inflation rate every time, because we don't want continually higher inflation. Eventually, you're going to have to deal with that problem and then try to get inflation expectations back down. So that's your standard positive demand shock story. Now remember, this was the natural rate of unemployment in the context of the Phillips curve. This is sometimes called the NAIRU, which is the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And the idea is that if you were going to try to push the natural rate below that point, then you start accelerating inflation. So this is sort of consistent with stable inflation. But if we kind of push it here to point B, then that's going to see rising inflation, and then as people adjust to it, even higher inflation. And so that's the idea of calling it the NAIRU. Now, this is just an estimate, so just like we don't know exactly what the natural rate is, well, this is the natural rate. We could be wrong about that level, but if we see that we're pushing inflation up when that unemployment rate falls, then that tells us something about our relationship to where that NAIRU is, where the natural rate is. Now, sometimes you'll see in certain textbooks or questions that when they do the adjustment here, so remember we were going to point B, and then like over here we were going to point C, which was a little higher. So I was drawing it like this. That's the way I usually draw it. But sometimes you'll see it just come right across here, and then they'll have the long run adjustment this way, so it doesn't exactly match up with the higher inflation of point C compared to point B, but that's just sometimes people draw it that way. For our purposes, not really going to matter too much as long as you're moving in the right direction. We know we're going to be onto this higher short run Phillips curve after this adjustment compared to where we were before. So even though it's not showing the higher inflation compared to B to C, for our purposes, not really going to matter too much, because we just want to see whether we've moved on to a new short run Phillips curve or not. So this, this short run aggregate supply is shifted, and we know we're going to have to shift from that original curve over to here. So just in case you see it that way. Negative supply shock. So remember, just compare it to the aggregate demand graph. We know that we're going to end up at point B here, and now we're in recession. We've got higher inflation, we've got stagflation, not a really good situation to be in. And so remember, as soon as this curve shifts, we know we're going to be onto a new short run Phillips curve, because point B has to have low output, which means higher unemployment. And so we can't just move here, because that means that inflation's lower, right? Well, this is giving us higher inflation, so it can't be that I'm moving in this direction, and it can't be that I'm moving in this direction, because this is showing me I'm in recession, right? So I can't have falling unemployment, so I know I have to go in this direction. So immediately I'm shifting on to a new short run Phillips curve. And then what happens after that? Well, it depends on what happens over here. If we just have the self-correction, this could just shift back, and then this shifts back over here. If we contract here because we want to deal with the inflation problem, well, we can go this way, which means we're going to end up going this way. And then when this eventually shifts back down to here, this might shift back down to here. If we were to expand from this point, then if we're going this way over here, then we're going this way over here. And then point C, this equilibrium, would correspond to this equilibrium. Okay, so what's the purpose of all this? If this is basically telling us the same story of our aggregate demand graph, well, just like a lot of things in macro, it helps you to understand the language of the debate about macro. So here are just some headlines that I pulled out. So even if you think that the Phillips curve is quote unquote dead, well, that really just means the slope of this is really flat. So if we see that unemployment is falling and you're not really seeing a rise in inflation, you could say, well, the Phillips curve isn't working, or it's dead. So you could just have that debate in terms of the slope of the Phillips curve, and that's basically what this graph is talking about over here. They're looking at the slope of the Phillips curve. So how flat is that curve? So as long as people in macro are talking this way, then we should at least understand the language. So here the trade-offs are talking about the Phillips curve. This chart is a Phillips curve, and here over here in the Economist. So just like a lot of stuff in macro, you at least want to understand the terms of the debate.